Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Spider-Man review series, and today we return to the first movie-based Spider-Man game, just called Spider-Man. Which, now that I think about it, it is kind of confusing because there's actually several games in this series that are just called Spider-Man, but it's the movie game, so yeah, I guess you just call it Spider-Man the movie. Makes it kind of easier, even though officially I guess it's just called Spider-Man. Anyway, now I feel like after we've looked at the first 3D Spider-Man title, it'll be a bit more interesting to make comparisons to seeing how this game played out. See, movie-based games are always a toss-up as to whether you're going to get a somewhat quality product or something that was rushed out the door to meet the deadline of the film's release. Activision was still the publisher at this point, but Neversoft had moved on to developing the Tony Hawk franchise full-time, so the studio Treyarch stepped in. Treyarch had actually been acquired by Activision the year before the film's release, and they even developed the Dreamcast version of the PlayStation Spider-Man game. So after Activision had released the first two 3D games on older hardware, they now had to bring that style into the next-gen consoles of the Xbox, PlayStation, and GameCube. Thankfully, Treyarch was smart in deciding to use the design template of the earlier 3D games to make this new entry. However, does Spider-Man do enough to truly set itself apart from those earlier entries, or does it come off as just a cheap copy-paste effort? The game follows the plot of the film with some slight additions to bulk out that narrative. The story has Spidey facing Vulture, Shocker, and Scorpion, all in addition to the film's antagonist, the Green Goblin. For some reason, one villain is exclusive to the Xbox version, and that would be Kraven the Hunter. This results in the game having 2 extra levels on the Xbox, and I couldn't find any legit reason as to why Kraven is only on this version, but if I had to guess, I would assume that since the Xbox console had only released a few months before this game launched, someone at Microsoft must have paid to get the added content to try to push consumers into buying that version. In fact, when I went to the store to purchase this game, I had every intention of picking up the PS2 version. Only the guy at the counter mentioned how the Xbox version had the extra levels with Kraven, so I changed my mind. Not necessarily because I knew who Kraven was, but because I figured, hey, more levels means more game to play. The great thing is that the added villains fit in rather nicely around the plot from the film, and they never create any plot holes or inconsistencies with that core story. Some plot points from the film are tweaked, but it's nothing too drastic. For example, Uncle Ben's killer is now part of a gang, and the opening levels have you dealing with all of the gang members instead of just running after him. Also, the plot point from the movie when Peter realizes that the Green Goblin will target Mary Jane next and he goes to call her to warn her is changed by having Peter taking a broken part of the Goblin's glider, which leads him to Oscorp, which then has him learning that the company is working with deadly chemicals and he has to shut that down, before finally landing in Norman's office and he sees that he has pictures of Mary Jane. Okay, so technically that last one was a bit more drastic of a change than what was in the film, but we still got to the same plot point in the end. The side story involving the other villains are interesting enough. After you've suited up in the real Spider-Man suit, the game throws both Shocker and Vulture at you after they rob a store. You spend the early levels chasing down Shocker and then dealing with Vulture. The Kraven the Hunter arc of the game fits in nicely too, as it's basically set up as Norman hiring Kraven to hunt Spider-Man down. Kraven lures Peter to the zoo and then poisons him, only giving up the antidote when you make it through all of his traps and beat him. The one storyline that kinda goes nowhere despite being interesting is the plot with Scorpion. He appears at first being tracked by Oscorp as they're looking for Spider-Man and tracking his spider DNA, so they end up picking up Scorpion's DNA on the map as well. Norman wants to trap both of them with his little spider hunter robot thingies, and so the pair meet up and Spider-Man helps out Scorpion before realizing that he's completely paranoid and thinks that Spider-Man is his enemy. We never really learn why Scorpion is so paranoid or why he thinks he's being followed and why he's so nutty. After you beat him, he's knocked out, but then he gets up and runs off and we never see him again. I mean, we do meet Scorpion again in Spider-Man 3's game, but he looks drastically different and it's definitely not the same character. Also, they never actually name this Scorpion here as Mac Gargan, but the one in Spider-Man 3 is named Mac Gargan, so maybe this Scorpion was just completely unrelated. I just feel like the Scorpion arc doesn't really go anywhere, and it's kind of left hanging since Spider-Man webs up all the other villains and leaves them for the cops, but not Scorpion. I always assumed as a kid that we'd run into this version of him again in the future games, but clearly that didn't happen. The game is broken up into short levels similar to the design of the levels from the previous 3D games. These levels will have Spider-Man traversing the New York skyline, or exploring various interiors like a warehouse, Grand Central Station, and even Oscorp. The general goal of each level is for Spider-Man to beat up all the bad guys and reach the end, or to just defeat a boss. There are also chase levels with Vulture and the Green Goblin, and the goal of these levels is to keep close to the target and occasionally stop to fix objects that the target will break. Levels are short and that they'll probably take you about maybe 5 to 10 minutes on average, but depending on your skill level. This does make the game a breeze to play through, but it keeps things fresh enough, and the variety to the level design makes you want to see what's going to come next. Completing levels grants you points based on how you performed. You're graded on combat, time completed, if you found any secrets, and if you took damage, and these points are used to unlock bonus features in the secret store after you've beaten the campaign. Naturally, you have all of Spider-Man's abilities at your disposal. You can web swing, stick to walls, web up enemies in addition to your standard kicks and punches. Web swinging is improved over the last two games in that you can no longer get stuck in one direction with very little control of your movement. Now web swinging is smoother as you can quickly swing in one direction, then break the line and start swinging in the opposite direction. Also, no need to worry about buildings to stick your webs to. It's an older Spider-Man game, so naturally you just attach those webs straight up into the air. Combat can seem a bit repetitive at first, but you can find combo markers that teach you new combos. This at least gives you one new combo to play around with on each level. Finding the combo markers does require a little bit of exploration in the levels, but they're never really that far off the beaten path. Without this ability, combat has you hitting your enemy a few times while taking a few hits yourself, before you'll have to run around the area to find a health pickup and then return to combat. This becomes incredibly more frustrating on the higher difficulty levels as enemies take a ton of health off you, and if you get surrounded, it's not going to end well, especially if the enemies have guns. You can also web zip around for quick movement, though it can be a bit of a hassle to get it to work properly, and you can even drop down from the ceiling yo-yo style, but you'll probably never really use it in the game for any real reason, but hey, it looks cool. The general controls work well enough, though sometimes I swear moving around can be an issue. You'll try to turn around only to find that Spider-Man's continuing in the other direction. I don't think this is just a controller issue, because I've played this game on my original Xbox and my Xbox 360 with two different sets of controllers, and it always seems to happen, so I don't think it's a controller issue. Also on a side note, the game doesn't offer any tutorials explaining how to control Spider-Man during the main campaign. When you start a new game, you have to choose to play through the tutorial, which is optional. And it's a shame too, because not only does the tutorial explain the basic controls and some of the advanced web moves, but the tutorial is narrated by Bruce Campbell, and he brings his usual wit and humor to make the tutorial definitely worth a look. The tutorial is only really needed to explain the new height meter and compass. This essentially splits the compass feature that was in the older Spider-Man games, as now the compass is its own thing as it just points you in the right direction, and the height meter tells you how much higher or lower your objective is. When I first started playing this game, back in the day, as soon as I got it, I wasn't entirely sure where I needed to go, because it's kind of an open level and you're not really sure where to go, and I just sort of landed on rooftops and stumbled my way through, and then I thought, well, maybe I should stop and actually, play the tutorial. Although, most of the other stuff you can figure out on your own. The game also tries to implement a stealth mechanic which involves Spider-Man hiding in the shadows to avoid enemy contact, though there are a few moments in the game in which to actually use this mechanic. The mechanic is designed by the game saying that if the picture of Spider-Man's face in the corner of the screen is darkened, you're hidden from enemies. While you're hidden, you can still web up enemies, but that's about it. You'll still have to eventually drop down to take them out. So there's no real way to knock enemies out with stealth and not actually go down to engage them. The only level that really truly promotes the stealth mechanics is when Spider-Man breaks into Oscorp. Here you have to find 5 active computers to download pieces of a code, and you can web zip around, and it's very easy to keep away from the guards in this section. The later levels in Oscorp still want you to sneak around and avoid cameras and laser grids, and it's kinda possible to keep the stealth mechanics going, but more likely than not, you're just going to barge through these areas to finish the level faster because it's just not worth the aggravation. You have to be very precise with your web movements and stuff on these things, and it doesn't really work out. And again, the only penalty you get for getting caught is that the guards come out and try to shoot you, and you're agile enough to get away from them. So honestly, every time I play through this section of the game, I try my best for about 5 minutes, and then I just go crazy and web swing my way through the end, because you can pretty much hide in certain corner rooms and stuff, wait for the alarms to die down, and then continue on your merry way. It's kind of a shame though, because I wish there was more options for players to use stealth to get around enemies. There are moments when the game tells you that your stealth attempt has failed, but you'll be at a complete loss as to how you would have succeeded. I always get confused with this in the opening levels during the warehouse section, because it clearly wants you to stealth your way around, but then the door opens to let the other guys in, and the warning comes up saying I failed. I don't get it. If the game had some ways of taking out enemies with the stealth, like hiding up in the ceiling and webbing them and knocking them out that way, then the stealth segments I think would have been more enjoyable. The game also has a bunch of bonus features that promote some replay value. Like I said, that campaign is kind of short, so anything here helps. You can play a bowling mini game where basically the enemies in the game are the pins. There's an arena mode where I think after you beat 100 guys, you get to fight Bonesaw from the opening FMV, so that's kind of cool. There's obstacle courses for you to practice your web swinging, and while these are fun, there's no real reward though for completing them. There are various costumes that you can switch into, like the standard Peter Parker costume, the wrestling suit, the Alex Ross designed costume that didn't make it into the movie but was used in concept art, and the game even has the option to play as the Green Goblin, although it's Harry in the suit, not Norman. You basically play through sort of an alternate version of the game. It's the same levels, but basically Harry's trying to find out why his father had the Green Goblin outfit and stuff, and then you end up fighting a sort of alternate version Green Goblin. It's still the Green Goblin, but it's just with a deeper voice. It's kind of weird. It doesn't really end any way special. It's not like a giant what-if story, but I kind of thought it was a cool little feature. I mean, granted, I'd never played the PlayStation games at this point, but having played the last PlayStation Spider-Man game and seeing that there was a what-if storyline of like how things could have been different, this is kind of a nice throwback to that without actually calling it that. And I like playing around as the Goblin because he's got different abilities than Spider-Man. You get to use the glider, the pumpkin bombs, and he's got different moves even when he fights with his combos. So it's kind of a nice little bonus feature to play through the game again. And honestly, I kind of wish the later games had features like this because I thought this was the coolest bonus feature ever when I was a kid. I secretly was praying that they were going to let something like this happen in Spider-Man 2 and we get to play as Dr. Octopus because I thought that would be like the sickest thing. The presentation is good for an early Xbox, PS2, and GameCube game. Tobey Maguire and Willem Dafoe both provide the voices for their respective characters, and they do an adequate job with the material. The lines aren't one-to-one from the film, so obviously it's the writing of this game that might be bringing down the performance. There are several FMVs throughout the game, and while they were great when the game first came out, they really haven't aged all that well. Well, to be fair, it's only the ones where there's actual human character faces, because they kind of come off as unnatural. If it's Spider-Man in the mask or the Green Goblin in the suit, that's fine. There's nothing too off-putting about that, but like some of the shots of Peter and Norman and Mary Jane, Uncanny Valley kind of pops up here and there, but hey, it's a 20-year-old game. It's not going to look like it's the greatest thing. The levels are diverse and each one has its own style, and there isn't a ton of copy and paste to them, which is something, like I said at the beginning of the review, you would see a lot in movie-based games. There's warehouse interiors, a sewer, Grand Central Station, a clock tower, the zoo, and the inside of Oscorp. And each one has its own unique identity. Even the city levels that are all out in the open, they all manage to be different, despite the fact that you would think that they could just copy and paste the same buildings and have you swinging through them just at different times of day. And even the enemy types change as the game goes on. I mean, sure, you got your standard 4 different models for gang members, but they only stick around for like the first 3 levels before they get swapped out for another enemy type, like Shocker's goons or the killer robots. And I like this a lot because, like I said again, most movie-based games wouldn't have bothered with that, and they would have just left the 5 or 6 models for the base enemies and just planted them throughout the entire game. So, not bad. The soundtrack is also rather good at creating a nice mood based on certain situations in each level. Whether you're web-swinging, sneaking around on the ceiling, or battling the various villains, the music fits each situation perfectly, creating the right mood and atmosphere. And honestly, any video game that I've played 20 years ago that I can still remember the music in my head to this day, even if I haven't played it in so long, it's a win in my book. If I can remember your musical score, you've done something right. Overall, Spider-Man is one of those rare exceptions that proves that not every movie-based game is complete garbage. Sure, it might not be perfect, and the overall campaign can be completed in a couple of hours, but the levels are fun enough and the bonus content is enough to keep players engaged. I like running through this game every couple of years when I'm feeling nostalgic. And back in the day, I played the hell out of it. I'd replay the game with the different costumes, I'd play around with the cheat code menu, which unlocked all the bonus features, and hey, it even unlocked different character skins, like playing as Shocker or Mary Jane. Although, when I say you can play as Mary Jane, I mean only in like the first run copies of the game, because apparently later re-releases, they took her out for, well, we'll just Google it and it'll pop up, trust me. Honestly, I don't think it was a big deal, but apparently they didn't like the idea. There was just so much to love about this game. And while I never really experienced the 3D Spider-Man games until more recently, I had played that demo disc that I mentioned in the last review, and going from that to this just felt like the biggest jump ever, so I enjoyed it immensely. So join us next time as the Spider-Man review series continues as we get to look at Spider-Man 2. Thanks for watching.